weekend. My name's Randy Conan with Red River Farm Network. I'm sitting here with Kyle Nelson and Scott Hitter from Farmers National Company. And our program is titled Have We Peaked? The latest in the land market. And if you've got questions, wave your hand. We've got Don running around with a microphone, or Whitney or Sierra, one of the Red River Farm Network crew will get a microphone to you so you can ask your question. But otherwise, we're just going to have a conversation between the three of us, and we're going to talk land values, rental values, a little bit everything pertaining to what Farmers National Company does. And we'll just start with Kyle. What's happened with this land market since we were here at Big Iron last year?
The word we've been using around the office is chaotic, or maybe erratic. And when, as an appraiser, we're talking about the actual data, the results of these sales. And there's a couple functions there. Obviously, you've got tremendous demand, you've got financial wherewithal to buy, and then another component, we've had a ton of public auction sales. And in many cases, those are multi-tract auction sales. And the way we are doing those, and many, you do high bidder choice. In other words, you're bidding to a high point, and then that high bidder picks whatever tract they want. Be all of it, could be 1, 3, whatever. So the result of that is you can have bidders bidding against each other that may want different things. You may have people in the mix that only want one parcel. So once they're out of the mix, then you've got another set of bidders. So I always use a certain sale last year as an example of what happened. It's 5 quarters of land, all pretty similar in quality.
Yep, we're going to switch microphones here. You're going to go arm there the way it looks. Pretty well all wired up. Okay.
So anyways, there's 5 quarters of land, high bidder choice. The first round, the high bid, I wrote it down here, $6,500. Then that bidder was out because they only wanted 1 quarter. Then the next quarter was $5,700. Then that bidder was out. They had their 1 quarter. Then the next one was $4,700. That bidder was out. Then the last 2 quarters went to bidder at $3,700. Really no difference in the land. So that's an example of when I say chaotic and erratic. As an appraiser, I mean, how do you rationalize those differences? It's just those factors that I mentioned and the mode of sale.
Do you see, going back to that first buyer that bid the higher price or paid the higher price, you see them backing away thinking, maybe I can get it a little cheaper if I hold back a little bit?
That can be it sometimes. In that case, my understanding was they wanted to buy 1 quarter. And I got that quarter, and whether the other bidders wanted that same quarter, it's hard to say. And like I said, in that case, the land was all pretty similar. And we've seen that a lot in those kind of settings where, the data set in and of itself just doesn't make sense, and it becomes down to motivation. It can come down to, all these sales are per deeded acre, and one piece might have a lot fewer tillable acres, and it sells for less for deeded acre, but when you do the math, it actually sold for more for tillable acre than a nice square quarter, for example. I've seen that. So it's just one of those things. It's a sign of strength and, strength in the market.
Have you seen it change or stabilize here as we moved into 2023?
I would say the stabilization is probably, if you want to use that term, we're not setting a record every sale more than anything. And in fact, there are some sales that are probably a little soft compared to what we thought they were going to be. But it's just location is a huge part of it also.
Well, that's what I was going to think. Especially if I've got a son that's coming on board that wants to farm, I need a couple extra acres. But if I've got to drive 15 miles with a tractor or I've got to drive 2 miles, that's going to be a huge difference of how much I'm going to pay, right? Are you seeing that or not?
Yeah, both in terms of buying and renting. There's a value to being that close. And certainly there's pockets still, that generally and haven't had public sales or public opportunity to buy a piece of land. So still, even though we have moderating factors like interest rates and commodity prices, there's still cash out there, and if something came up in one of those areas, you could still see, tremendous strength.
So just the strength of the buying power out there has changed some of that perspective also. At one point, if you're really focused on what you're willing to spend, you're going to be for sure picking the quarters closer to where your operation is. If you have more discretionary money, you may say, hey, if I can get this piece farther away for this money, I'm interested.
Who's buying?
I think in the past year, we did see an uptick in investor interest. I can't explain that with what, you could get a CD for, but I think we're going to see that wane a little bit just because, you can put that money somewhere else and make it, a better rate of return than 1.9 or 2.5%, which is maybe what farmland return is right now. So the split we had seen company-wide is maybe 70-30, 70% farmer, 30% investor. But the caveat with that is, what's an investor? Certainly we sell land to a farmer, but he's not farming it. It's maybe in a different area or just into buying land, or maybe it's somebody that already owns land in that area. So you get into a little bit of a thing there with what's your definition of an investor? Are they just a flat out from out of the area and they're just looking for a rate of return? Usually what we deal with is there's a connection there of some sort in the case of an investor.
One of the things I would add to that is, we always say, well, is the investor buying more? Is the investor buying less? I would say the biggest impact we've seen on who the buyer is more the type of farmer. Is it the seasoned guy? Is it the multi-generation guy? Or is it a young guy? These prices, getting to be the interest rates, the guy without the depth of the equity, they're probably not the buyer anymore.
Are you seeing many young guys being able to buy farms?
Actually, I'm in the process of selling one right now. And the advantage there is the beginning farmer loan through the Farm Service Agency. Those are still very low. But, there again, that buyer is somewhat limited. Those generally take longer to get the financing worked out. So it's a bit limiting to them in a public setting because we usually advertise a closing in 30 to 45 days. But in some cases, what happens there is a relative, a father, a mother buys it, and then once that financing comes through, they sell it to the next generation.
Yeah. And I would say that the young guys are still buying, but maybe not so much in the public setting. Just for what Kyle said, the time frame for them to get the guaranteed loans, the grants, whatever's out there, it's time consuming. They have to be looking pre-sale, so to speak. So it's probably more on the private side that they're looking to buy.
Are you seeing sales kind of spread over the year? It used to be kind of a seasonal thing, didn't it, when you saw land sales?
Yeah, it used to be, I would say even November to March, and then it started being more September to March. And really with online auctions, it can be any time of year. The only month, July, I don't think is the greatest month, but aside from that, you can do it anytime. And the thing is, I always say is you don't know. You can think you can have the perfect time, but you don't know until after the fact. I can recall strategizing in the past about having a sale right when the sugar beet payment came out. That might be great, but it might be all for nothing. So, that's the advantage the internet gives us these days, is being able to have it virtually any time of year, and you don't have to worry about weather wrecking it. It might affect it, in terms of having a live auction. But I had a couple of years ago, I had a blizzard. I had one guy there, and everyone was bidding online, and it went fine.
And it's one of the things that's nice, if you got a lender involved, what's your crop going to be? What's your income? There's some security on that side of it. The farmer's ready to buy year round, but maybe the lender says, let's pick a time here that makes sense. So factor some of those things in as well.
What about like tiled grounds that bring higher values of tiled, not tiled, improved?
It's kind of all over the board. Generally, yes. The thing is, there's generally not a lot of tiled land that comes on the market, because most of the tiling is being done by active operators. So it doesn't end up hitting the market. As an appraiser, that's the question I always get asked. What's that tile add? And there's not a one answer. I would say up to a year ago, my answer was it's probably not adding what you spent on it directly. Obviously, there's other benefits if you're farming it, the yield, the consistency, all those sorts of things. I would say with the market uptick in the last year, I could justify it more so, but still we see data where there's some tiled ground and untiled ground, and there's why I use the word chaotic or erratic. We don't always see that perfect trend line correlating with that in this area. I can tell you other areas where it's been around longer, and it's maybe not all pattern tiled. Olivia, Minnesota is the place I always bring to mention. The corn capital of the world is what they peg themselves, but I see a clear distinction there between tiled and untiled ground, because it's usually selective tiling, and it's not the $1,200 an acre it is here. It's half that, and you see a big difference there. But here, it can be all over the board.
It's one thing with tiling, if it's not tiled and it's a farmer and he's interested in that ground, he may be willing to bid that up because he gets the tax advantage, he gets the improvement of the soil. So compared to something that's already tiled, he may push that non-tiled price fairly close to what that tiling is.
The one thing, go ahead, Scott.
Go ahead.
The one thing, different ground has a different effect tiling has on it. The best and most efficient use of it is on lighter ground with a high water table. Generally you see immediate impact right there. Heavy ground, I think typically less so. You might see a consistency factor, but you're not going to see an immediate 25% jump in yield generally. So that's a factor too.
Yeah.
I farmed in that west central Minnesota area, just north of Olivia there, and they always told us tiled ground would take about 3 years before you saw an improvement in a heavy black soil.
Yep.
And I would, on heavy ground, yeah, I could see that. And so it's not one size fits all with.
Yeah. I don't want to veer too terrible far off here, but on the management side, I manage quite a bit of land in the number of proposed tiling projects that we have. We have a lot of proposals out there. I manage ground. Some of it's pretty, a lot of potholes, things like that. There's some salinity. It will improve with the tiling. The challenge is for an absentee landowner to justify that. What's the expense? What's the additional return on that? To your statement, up to 3 years before you really start seeing a return. We can't adjust the rents right away once that expense is made. So.
Yeah, do you find tenants willing to maybe pay for some of that tiling themselves or not?
The bulk of the tiling projects that I'm actually getting completed, the tenant is participating at some level in order to do that. As well as the owner, be it not necessarily a reduced rent, but not an increased rent, longer term, and some guarantees on a payback for the expense if something changes in the rental relationship.
That's what I was going to say. Most of the time at that point, the tenant would like a longer term lease on that then, right?
You bet. Absolutely. All tenants want a long term on the lease, but once there's additional investment involved, they deserve that, so to speak. But as the owner of that ground, you want a fair return on that also. So, you can have a longer term, but possibly put in some type of a flex provision in there, the rent. So when the yields do start increasing, then the owner will benefit a little bit from that as well.
As long as we're talking about leasing and management, let's talk about Farmers National Company and the management side of that. You do a lot of that.
We do, yeah. Farmers National it's a large company as far as the farm management. I believe we're 95 years old, something like that. And that's how the company actually started, was from the dirty 30s, and the lenders were getting the land back. They didn't know how to manage it, so that was basically the start of this company.
Primarily absentee landowners then?
So it's we manage land for absentee landowners, and we do quite a bit for trust companies as well. So essentially, they're all absentee, yes.
Kyle, you're a land appraiser. Describe your role. What is your day-to-day job like?
Well, one of the misnomers about appraising, and a lot of times people appraising and surveying and assessing. They use them interchangeably. And they'll think it's just a matter of looking in a table, almost like a hail adjustment or something like that. But ultimately what we do is try to interpret what is the market doing, or what factors is the market. And in some cases, like I mentioned, it's just erratic and chaotic. For a while, I remember 15 years ago in the Red River Valley here, it's like, is it flat and black? That's what was driving it, because you had a lot of investors at that time, and they didn't know soil quality and what was a better soil and what was a worse soil. So flat and black looks great to me. And so I remember appraising stuff where I know this is better than this, but I'm not appraising it that way because that's what the market's doing. So ultimately, we try to analyze this stuff, and what is the market telling you? In some areas, there's no difference between cropland, hayland, and woods, and that would be, in central Minnesota, for example, Bemidji or whatever. Are woods contributing value? Are they not? And those change by the area. But generally, you're going to, look at soil type. I used this example yesterday. If you get in the northern Red River Valley, Glendon silt loam is what everybody, salivates over. Down here, it's not as much. So it's about interpreting that data and what is the market telling you.
Those type of crop that's being grazed on it, did have an impact at all on the value or not?
I look at that just as a gauge for the quality of land. So, some of your higher value crops like sugar beets, edible beans, potatoes, you're not going to put that on junk for land. So when I'm trying to, I do look at that, and, that tells you something, and those are higher value crops and generate more income and so forth. So, but there's nothing you hang your hat on. That's just one thing. There's still some operators that raise just wheat and soybeans. That's it. So there's no one factor. As technology improves, we get more maps and software, and we can look at maps through series of years and see what looks bad this year. Does it look bad every year? And none of those factors are the one thing you hang your hat on. Not even soil types, because those are limited. How accurate those are. Vast oversimplification of land quality. So there's a lot of factors we look at.
Talk about the productivity index. Iowa's got one, right?
CSR.
Yeah.
Corn suitability rating. And it's a factor, very big factor in buying decisions there, because the state, as I've always understood it, puts a lot of money into analyzing that. And in Iowa, you've got pretty consistent drainage throughout the whole state. Because if it's not good drainage, they've tiled it. And that's not the case in North Dakota. Productivity index in North Dakota is based on wheat only. So it tends to some heavier ground tends to have a high PI because of that. And it's maybe not great corn ground. And on the flip side, some lighter ground that grows tremendous corn and even good sugar beets potentially, it maybe doesn't hold moisture to raise good wheat. So those are factors, but yet I might know that, but if the buyers are all making their decision based on that PI, and it's got an 85 PI, even though I think this one at 65 is better, that's my job, is to decipher that.
If anybody's got any questions, Phil, just get a hand, we'll get a microphone in front of you. Let's continue on that. I guess the title of our presentation here is Have We Peaked? We haven't talked land values at all. What are we seeing? Have we leveled off, or are we still seeing values increase?
Want to start?
It depends. 100%. It's when you think you've seen the last of the record sales, all of a sudden along will come a real high price sale. But there was a recent sale down pretty close to where I live, and the ground didn't look good. The sales results showed that. So it's all over the board. It truly is. It's more chaotic today than it was a year ago even.
I would say when we're proposing a sale to somebody, I would say, and we always, of course, always try to be realistic, not anticipatory. I would say we'd be happy to be at or near what the expectations we give them. I don't think we're going to count on exceeding that, as opposed to a year ago. Yeah. In many cases, we just went by that, flew by that. Our opening bid ended up being at our reserve price. But where we're going to see it, and it always, when the market gets hot, marginal ground goes up more than it should. And when the market stabilizes or corrects itself or whatever, that's the first ground that you see take a hit. And we're seeing that right now in a few cases. And it doesn't have to be marginal ground. It just can be, it's got problems. I know there was one, I mean, it was a half section with 9 east-west tree shelter belts in it, you know, that needed to be taken out, and it needed to be drain tiled. Well, you're not going to drain tile around those tree shelter belts. So you'd have a significant expense in getting rid of those tree shelter belts. So that's an example of, it's not marginal ground, but there's just issues.
Nuisance ground, so if there's small pieces versus large tracts.
I've seen both.
There is a lot of liquidity and strength, buying power in that market right now. So if it's a large piece and it makes sense, there's the power out there to buy that piece. So
I think we've seen some, normally you worry about a tract being too large. You know, let's say it's one piece and you really don't want to chop it up. And normally, you know, you worry about if there's many buyers that have the wherewithal to buy that entire chunk. Right now, we haven't been too concerned about that. On the other side of that spectrum, you know, you deal with small tract, like a 40. In some cases, I mean, I've seen it take a real hit because, I mean, you can hardly turn your equipment around on 40 acres, perhaps, but it can go the other way because the dollars you're talking about on 40 acres involves a lot more people and maybe even a non-farmer that hasn't been into land buying. And I've seen it go both ways. A 40 sell for less because it's a 40 and it's a hassle, it's too small, and seen it sell for a premium because, you know, the dollars you're talking about is not as significant as a section.
Well, it kind of boils down to cap rates and rates of return, doesn't it?
Right. That hasn't been a motivating factor, I don't think, lately, even for investors, which is kind of an oddity. Usually they're void of emotion, and it's heavy on what's that rate of return. It didn't seem in the last year that was a big deal. It might begin to be a big deal. And that, you know, farmers, of course, it's probably not a factor. But we've certainly seen those drop, you know, maybe as much as a full point. You know, maybe they used to be 3%, and that's gross, less taxes, less a 5% management fee. And certainly now I see some 1.5, low 2s, something like that.
you know, I would add to that, whether it's the farmer or an investor, the cap rates, it's not that it's not important. It's always important, but I think the investor was willing to, instead of maybe a 5%, maybe he was willing to take a 3 or a 4. He's become more educated in the fact how good of an investment farmland is long term. You know, you look at the stock market, you look at the global economy. You know, the last presentation we were talking the war in Ukraine, things like that. You know, what is going to happen? We don't fully know the answer to that. Sometimes that farmland investment is a much more stable investment than some other options that are out there. Even if they're getting a higher yearly cap rate, the long-term return, farmland is a good investment.
Are you seeing current interest rates or the talk of maybe higher interest rates down the road having an impact on sales or not?
It's not what we would have thought. I would say that.
Not yet.
Not yet. It may get there. I think it's making. I would anticipate it going forward. I would think it's going to make some buyers more selective, and there again, where the marginal ground comes into play. Because I still think there's buying power out there, but you know that's you know, when things are moderate, you know, it's like the excuses. What excuse? You know, the access isn't great. That's when that becomes more of a factor, and the buyer being more selective. So it's, you know, you would think that interest would have had and I'll say this, I know even last spring in Iowa, where you're talking $15,000 to $20,000 an acre land, those guys down there told us it is having a factor because you're just dealing with that much more dollars, you know, and that much more money being borrowed in a case. I mean, they're not paying all cash for you know, $15,000 an acre, probably.
You know, I would say if interest rates where they're at, you know, there's a good chance they could bump up again. But there's still really good cash flow out on the farms right now. And this year is more spotty than probably last year. It's an overgeneralization when I'm saying, you know, everybody's having a heyday because the guys that got the rain, they're going to have a good crop. The guys that didn't, you know, they got a floor under them. through the insurances, but again, that's a percentage. So I would say the cash flow is almost as important as the interest rates right now. Let's say something happens. Let's say the war ends in Ukraine or something. If we start talking, sub $4 corn or $8 beans for an extended period of time, a lot of that equity will start. You're not going to be growing your equity. You're going to probably be chewing some of it up. Then you want to see people start talking about interest rates. That'll happen really quick.
Still plenty of equity out there then.
Yeah.
With this year's drought, are you seeing that mentality or just the drought stress, seeing that have an impact on whether a guy is looking at more land or not?
I think, it's a factor. It's an emotional, psychological factor, those things. But I think we've seen in the last cycle, when we had the uptick in 2012, 13, that crop insurance really stabilizes things. And Troy Swee, who's on the panel yesterday from south of Sioux Falls, and they've had some very subpar crops the last, 2 out of 4 years with drought, and I think a year of tons of PP, and they haven't seen it affect their land values there. And I think you got a point right at crop insurance for stabilizing that. So whether you look at that as good or bad, I would think it's any stabilization like that is good. So that's what I point to.
Step me through the process. If I've got land I want to sell, or if I'm looking to buy land, what's the process that we need to get involved? What gets us started?
Well, just understanding what you have, whether it's a market analysis or a full appraisal, just truly having a good understanding of what you have and what your objectives are. Are we realistic here? What is it worth? And once you get to that point and you truly are interested in selling, then you get a hold of a brokerage and have the conversation with them. What is the method to sell? What works in this area? What doesn't work? You find something that works. What do you want to work with? You get the agreement. You get a listing agreement signed, and then the brokerage goes to work, and they do the listing and the marketing and everything like that, and then they have the sale.
I would say in this area, traditionally this is not a land auction area. That's only been in the last 20 years, I would say. So, when the market is strong and you have a multitude of buyers, it's not only the way we look to sell it probably, but I look at it as an equitable fairness. Everyone's got an opportunity kind of mode, but that's the key to an auction, is having more than one motivated person. And you don't always have that. So in other times, we look at other modes. So it's a matter of having that discussion of what their goals are. Some people don't want a public auction. They feel it's a spectacle or whatever. Maybe the neighborhood that they're from or whatever. So maybe an online auction or some other avenue. It just depends on the circumstances, the location, and what the owners want.
Who's selling? Is it mostly estates?
Well, I would say a bulk. It's the next generation, usually, in many cases. And there's multiple owners. There's 3, there's 4, there's 5. Either one or all of them see the writing on the wall of what the future brings, and that's usually a headache. Either it's going to get passed down and further subdivided, or people don't agree. Either they flat out don't get along, or they don't want to agree on what to do with the land. Some want to keep it, some want to sell it, and that's a lot of what we end up dealing with, I would say. Or it could be an individual owning it and they're getting up in years, and they know the next generation is going to have an issue with that. They know the next generation doesn't give a hoot about the land. It's easier to divide up cash, as the old saying goes.
A few years ago, quite a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about urban sprawl and the 1031 exchange that held prices high, that next tier of counties out of around a city like Fargo or something. Are you still seeing some of that yet or not?
It's a factor that's there. It's not the driver. I don't think, because, what are you saving 15, 20% in tax? What sense does it make to bid up the land, 40%? I think when it first became a thing 20 years ago, it really fueled some sales surrounding Fargo-Moorhead. I've seen it less of an impact, even with the diversion I thought the money from that would have more of an impact than I've been aware of. So it's a factor. It helps the market, but I haven't seen it be a driver lately.
The diversion is having a little bit of an impact, anything?
A little bit. I mean, we've sold some land that the buyer was a diversion, but I didn't think the price was excessive because of it. And I think, you know, in some cases, some of the other bidders were the 1033 is what it's called with the buyout like that. That I know are active farmers. They still were being selective, I think, because they've got a 3-year window to use that money. It's not a 90 days, 60 days, whatever 1031 is.
We've got a question in the audience here.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I was just, I was thinking, what's your opinion? Are rents keeping up with the value for the sales of farmland, good cropland? I mean,
Sure.
I wonder in my area, we kind of think that, well, maybe we're lagging a little bit on cash rents versus what we're seeing for sale prices. And what's your opinion of that?
Sure. So my opinion on that would be no. I think the land values were going up at a faster pace than the rents were. That's pretty historic. And I would say, you know, we if it's a multi-year lease, for sure, no. If it's a 1-year lease, you know, we can move rent so much every year. It's a little bit harder to do a massive increase, a 30% increase or a 40% increase. You know, we saw some land values on sales jump tremendously in the last couple of years, and the rents just weren't following that fast. We do anticipate if there's a correction in this market, rents will be a little stickier to come back down though. So rents typically, they follow the market, but they're not gonna be one-to-one. There again, we start talking, what's your cap rate? You know, we're seeing a decrease in that cap rate over time.
If they correlated, then the cap rate would correlate too, you know, and I think that's a function of a couple of things. What's driving it? It's opportunity. You know, it's not that they don't care what it's worth a year from now or 2 years from now. It's the opportunity. I want it, I own it, and I have the opportunity to do so. And then I think on the other side, I might be putting words in Scott's mouth here, but you know, when we as farm managers raise rents this last go around, I think there's a little more conservative with that raise as opposed to 10 years ago. Because what happened 10 years ago, we had corn prices drop in half, and then you're sitting with, you know, a rent that we all know is a little too strong. You got landowners that count on X amount of income once it's there, so it's difficult to lower it too much. So my sense is this little adjustment in rents was maybe a little more conservative than 10 years ago.
So one of the things that we try and use to mitigate exactly what you're talking about, not necessarily the base of the rent, obviously that's not gonna go down, that's going up a little bit, but we'll try and put a flex provision in there. That farmer hits a home run, yield, price, both, then that owner is gonna participate in some of that additional income as well.
It sounds like Farmers National, with the management that you do, you are writing mostly cash rent, flex rent agreements, any share crop agreements?
Sure. So depends on the market that we're in. I'm fairly spread out where I manage. I do have some crop shares. The bulk of my rents are cash rents. I would say 40% of my rents have a flex provision on them. I can tell you going into 2024, I'm not looking at changing my cash rents a lot. You know, the commodity prices are soft. Who knows? You know, this last panel, they were talking, you know, we could be in a big overproduction here. High prices fix high prices. But what we're looking at doing is maintaining the rents and just adding a flex provision into that.
I would say we see more, as you transition south, you see more crop shares. Like in some of our land in eastern South Dakota, there's a lot of crop shares.
Crop shares and even some custom farming.
Custom farming, where technically that landowner is farming the land and we're managing, just hiring a farmer in the area to do each process along the way. But those tend to make more sense in corn and
And
soybeans.
it's really interesting. I manage some land in northeast South Dakota and some land in northwest North Dakota. In different regions, will tolerate different types of rents. So we work within those parameters. You know,
And you are based with your management fees. And so how does that typically work? Would you charge a percentage, or how do you do that?
exactly right. Yes. Yep. Yep. In the percentage, it will vary. You know, we try to have a minimum. We got to have enough meat in the game, so to speak, to make it worth our while. Obviously, the larger the farm, the more revenue, the smaller the percentage we can operate on.
What's the minimum? What's the minimum, and what's the maximum?
Well, if you're talking a 30 or 40,000 acre farm, I mean, you might be a pretty low percentage. If you're talking about 80 acres, you know, it might be as high as 7-8% or something like that. And actually, I think custom farms probably are a lower.
They're lower
because
there's just more volume.
Which I always thought of them as being higher because there's more work on our end, lining all that up, but there's more revenue to get a percentage of, which I hadn't thought
So
of.
if you and I had an initial conversation, if you're interested in looking at hiring Farmers National to manage your farm, I would come out there, and I've got all our company literature. We feel a minimum of $1,500 a year to do full management on a farm is a minimum fee, gross number that we feel we can operate on. We use a factor of 8%. If it's $100 rent, $8, 8%. So if that $8 is small enough acreage, we don't get to our $1,500 minimum. You know, somehow we want to get to that number. I manage farms that are considerably less than that. Am I making money on those farms when I go out to them? No, personally. But a larger the farm, obviously that 8% can come down.
Talk about a little more about the flex rents. How do they kick in? When we have a good crop, good prices? What happens when we don't?
Sure. So, you know, at the end of the day, we work for the landowner. No questions about that. One of the things I'm working for a landowner is giving the tenant the opportunity to make a profit as well. So the flex, if you can imagine it, technically you could write it into a lease. I've got some flexes. They're as simple as, you know, if corn is $5 on the Chicago Board of Trade, or beans are $12.50, there's an additional $20 rent. Just black and white. I've got some flexes where we'll look at the local elevator where the farmer's hauling in, so we protect that basis. We'll take a cash grain snapshot price, March 1st, June 1st, and November 1st. We average those three prices out. That gives us our price factor. We take that times his actual yield. In corn, we typically look at about 25% on corn and maybe in that 30% range on beans. So we'll take that gross number times that percentage in, you know, let's say the rent's $120 and that factor comes up to $150. There will be an additional $30 rent payment to the owner at that point in time based on those numbers.
I always kind of say it's kind of like a modified crop share
Yeah.
on paper with a guaranteed base.
Makes it a little easier that way too, I guess, with a high value crop. The sugar beets, the potatoes.
Yeah, and I always say it just floats along with the market. It works in. I manage some land where it's basically I'm the distant party. I mean, it's family, it's neighbors. It gets uncomfortable maybe, and flex lease works great. And in those cases, I might use a fairly conservative base rent. You might, you know, some marginal land might not be really marginal, but you can maybe grow really good crops on it, but it's just inconsistent. So it can be tough to pick a fair rent. And you know, Scott's right. I mean, we want the operator to make money. So we want to be fair as well. So having that flex float along, ideally with what the market is, you know, is the way to go, which is why we've seen more and more of it. And
you know, and that gets to be an answer to the question, you know, do the rents keep up with the land values? So it's a tool that we can use to to help mitigate that.
And one thing I see too, you know, of course, the older generation doesn't want to mess with it. Why can't I just pay one rent and be done with it? Well, and the younger generation sees it and understands that that's, you know, fair for everyone, and it's an advantage to them in the fact that they don't have to pay too much rent when they're not making money, but yet when they do have the bushels in the price, okay, some of it's going to go back to the landowner.
In a lot of times, the folks that we're managing land for, that farmland is a large part of their retirement living.
Oh, yeah.
They want to know, you know, what am I going to have for living this year? So we try and protect that base for them, but still give them an opportunity.
Is the flex rents the majority of how land is rented around here?
I don't think I would say that yet.
Really?
It's trending that way. You know, they're back to, you know, some of it's adoption. What are people willing to do? A lot of times when I go out to a farmer and I'll say, hey, you know, we'd like to put a flex on this. Oh, no, I'll pay you more rent. You know, they'd rather pay a little more rent than to actually go with that flex. Part of me is happy because that means that guy's opportunistic. He knows, or he thinks, he's hoping he's going to make more profit. So then I'm happy as well. But you know, it's a little bit of both. They don't want the headache sometimes.
I would say, I mean, there's a lot of professionally managed looking at it, but I have yet to encounter, they exist out there, but privately owned, you know, just doing it themselves that use a flex rent. They just don't understand it, don't want to track it, that sort of thing. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just, it's not, I don't think it's real common. Or they use, I've heard of some where honestly I don't understand it, but it's just simply a price factor. If the price of corn is this, then you owe me this much more, which, I don't know, to me is a oversimplification.
Talk technology, has that impacted the land market at all?
From a sales standpoint for us, I mean, it's ever evolving. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought of doing an online auction. So that's certainly one example. Certainly there's technology that helps us evaluate the land a little better and know what we're dealing with you know, vegetative growth maps and that sort of thing. I mean, drones are one thing that are coming into play. We don't use it a lot. We have the ability to use it for various things. Scott, do you have any input on that?
You know, I guess when you say technology, again, my question goes, it depends a little bit. What type of technology? If we're talking genetics in seeds, huge impact. You know, it's a year ago, I can't tell you how many times I was out talking to somebody, I'm like, the first thing they said, I don't know where the yield came from, but we're pretty happy with it. So, you know, improvements in genetics, that's a technology in my mind. That has improved. Being able to track your expenses as you go, you're doing more things, recording it and actively as you're applying, as you're harvesting. The technology is going to make the operators more knowledgeable in a time-sensitive manner. Absolutely, I think technology is going to play a big factor in it. Not necessarily always on the income side, but helping on the expense side.
And as far as marketing land, the thing to do 10 years from now, we maybe can't even conceive today. You know, we would, like I said, we never would have thought 10 years ago we're using the internet and online to auction.
I would think too,
ground.
like crop mix has made a difference over the years too, because we've become part of the Corn Belt.
Yeah, no, that's changed. That's changed, and that's a whole nother conversation. How that has changed us here in terms of values of land and rents. I mean, that's been the biggest. You can look at sugar beets and that's a factor too. But corn, I mean, it's raised in areas they never would have thought, you know, it would have raised it.
The economics say, you know, the economics kind of tell us what crops to raise, whether it's corn, bean rotation. You know, obviously, I love wheat, but does it pay to put it in the mix? Or, you know, will carbon credits come in some point and change that situation? I don't know the answer to that. Or maybe there'll be some stressors, you know, maybe we have some kind of disease pressure from not enough rotation at some point down the road. Those are just things that we'll wait and see.
Is there demand for pasture and rangeland?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. There's not as much of it. I mean, we don't have a lot of livestock in this part of
Yeah.
the state. So obviously with the price of livestock, I mean, we've seen some sales of it being pushed. We just see very little activity in this area of it. Where you really see you get it into South Dakota, it just pastures always brought more than it does right across the North Dakota line. But here, there's just not a lot of activity. Other than, you guys break it up to farming. I mean, they're chaotic. A year ago, there was some cluster sales in, I think, Dickey County, and all of them had some amount of pasture in it, and I think all of them broke up as much of it as they could, which, I'm like, well, I don't think I would, but they did, and we'll see how that turns out. You know, yeah.
What about if I've got a farm that's got a lease on it? Does that impact the marketability of that ground or not?
To sell it?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Oh, it's not going to improve it.
I would say in the last year when the market is strong, if you got a year on it, I'll use this example. I had a quarter section in northwest Lemoore County last spring. It had a year lease left on it of half or less what it should have been. It set the record in the county for the highest sale. It was $7,600 a deeded acre, maybe $7,800 a tillable acre in Lemoore County. So, but if you got beyond a year, it might start impacting it because, that operator, they want to farm it as soon as they can. Now, when when market conditions soften, that becomes yet another thing that it's like, I don't want to deal with that. So right now, I mean, a year, not a big deal for the most part, but yeah, certainly we'd rather not have it on there, but
Yep.
it is what it is.
One of the things I'd want to make sure and take a look at that lease, make sure there's not an option to renew or something like that. Then you kind of wade into some muddy waters pretty quick on that.
Absolutely. We want to make sure we see the lease.
Yeah.
They get many, well, it's this. No, I want to see the lease because there's clauses in there that, can be prohibitive, like a first right of refusal. I really don't want to touch trying to sell something with a first right of refusal.
I would imagine too, it would depend on if you've got, who's buying it. If it's another investor type or somebody that wants to actually run the land.
Yeah, obviously they're less, but chances are, if it's got a lease on it and we're selling it, it's a below market lease. Not always, but chances are. And Dale mentioned yesterday on the panel, a lot of the stuff we sell, one reason can be is that they know the rent is way too low. They don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation. So we're just going to sell it and take care of the problem right there. So that's typically what we see.
What do you see with rental rates in the coming year?
Interest is going up. That expense is there. Some of the fertilizers are going down. One of the big variables is the markets right now. At this stage, back to the stickiness of the rents. I don't anticipate rents to drop for 2024, assuming that they're right in 23. I do have a few rents, depending on where I'm at. We may increase the rents a little bit, maybe a 5%, something like that. The biggest thing I'm going to try and do is maintain the rents and add flexes into them.
If it's coming off a 3-year lease, might be something different. It might be an adjustment because that first year, that 3-year lease might have been previous to the activity we've seen, but that might be a case where you'd see an adjustment.
Yeah.
Well, we're about wrapping up, running out of time here, and we got another seminar coming up here shortly. Any final thoughts? Any final questions from the audience? Got a question over here.
Depends on where it's at. 11,000 might be a deal where it's at. So are you saying it's it's more than the market is at 11,000, or? Okay. Well, it comes down to what's that opportunity. It's always too much if it's public. Reality is, if you're farming and you don't own any land, it's gonna be a tough road to hoe down the road. So, you know, I can't give you an answer on it, but the value of that land being across the road is a lot, I would say. You know, obviously you gotta have the wherewithal to be able to buy it, but
has irrigated and has a pump, what happens to that? And he loses it.
well, the irrigator is a fixture that can be moved. When you start talking the pump and the well, tile, okay. Well, that's in the ground.
So what should have happened there was a strong understanding from both parties before that tile went in. So one of the things we'll look at, if we're managing a piece of ground and say the renter puts the tile in, we'll negotiate out what the rent will be, what the length of the lease will be, and what the exit terms are. We don't anticipate an exit, but if it does happen, a super simple way on something like that would be, let's do a 10-year amortization. Let's say the renter farms it for 5 more years. The 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th year he doesn't. The owner would pay back 50% of that tiling cost based on that particular situation. That's just one example.
The key to that and everything, get it in writing.
We're out of time here. We got another seminar coming up, so you guys gonna be able to be around to answer questions if they have more questions one-on-one.
Sure thing.
All
Absolutely.
right, Scott, Kyle, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you, guys.